And good morning, folks, and welcome. Rick here from Queen's College in St. John's. Delighted again to have our session on contemplative leadership. And Margaret, of course, will lead us through the session today. And without further delay, I'll pass it to you, Margaret, to lead us in a prayer and into your session.
Great. Thank you, Rick. So I'd like to open with the first verses of a Danish hymn that I introduced you to in the first session. So I invite you to pray with these words and then to take a moment of silence, and I'll close the silence after a little bit. So this is a hymn called "That Cause Can Neither Be Lost Nor Stayed." And I think of it as a contemplative leadership theme song. That cause can neither be lost nor stayed, that takes the course of what God has made, and is not trusting in walls or towers, but quietly growing from seeds to flowers. Each noble vision that has been wrought was first conceived as a fruitful thought. Each worthy cause with the future glorious, by quietly growing, becomes victorious. Now a few moments of silence. It is not trusting in walls or towers, but quietly growing from seeds to flowers. I think of that as the contemplative leadership theme song because, you know, contemplative leadership is so much like gardening. We can put the seeds in the soil when we garden, and we can water the garden, and we can pull the weeds, but we can't make things grow. It's God who makes things grow. It's that life force that makes things grow. And in gardening, as in so much of life, we quickly realize that we don't have the power to control everything, to predict everything. It depends on the weather, it depends on what insects come that year. It depends on the soil. We don't know ahead of time when we plant what the soil is like. And so all we can do is to do our best in our part and trust the process and keep paying attention. Keep paying attention to the forces around us and cooperate with God's work. So it's a co-creation with God, and contemplative leadership is the same. We have to keep paying attention and keep letting go, keep re-grounding ourselves to notice what's going on, and then let God do the work, and keep trusting. So today I'll pick up where I left off last week. You will recall that the first session 3 weeks ago was me telling my own story of burning out in a leadership role when I was a teacher of spirituality in a theological college, and felt like I was losing my soul, and so we can all get to that place in our leadership roles where we're not being the people that we want to be, that we feel God has called us to be. And so I invited you into some guided meditations, and you reflected on your own experience. And then I talked about discernment and how paying attention to your own experience, reflecting, noticing, and naming those ways that God works in and through you. As you do that, that provides your foundation for discernment, gets you in touch with your own core spiritual experience, and then that provides your foundation for discernment. And so then last week, I started talking about my book, The Soul of a Leader, in which I interviewed people about contemplative leadership and what it looks like for them and how they took the steps. First chose the path, as you can see here, followed their hearts, found partners, dared to dream. And then how, it's one thing to choose the path, and it's another thing to stay on track during all of the ups and downs and all the challenges of leadership, and especially as you're seeking to be a contemplative leader. And Gerald asked last week about some of the contemplative practices that these leaders used. And so I talked a little bit about those and what helped them stay grounded. So today I'll talk about the last section of the book, Persevering to the End. Again, you can choose the path, you can stay on track through the ups and downs, and then how do you keep persevering when it gets really tough, when it looks like it could be the end of your ministry or the end of your service in an organization or any project that you're doing. So I'll talk some about principles I discovered as I interviewed people and how they persevered to the end. So let's start with Sisters of the Road Cafe and breaking the cycle of violence. Jenny Nelson was the founder of Sisters of the Road Cafe in Portland, Oregon. And the founding of the cafe came out of over 100 hours of conversation with homeless women. So Sisters of the Road was founded for homeless women. And one of the most common things that these women said in their interviews was, we need a safe space for ourselves and our children. And Jenny said, okay, we will set up a cafe and we'll call it Sisters of the Road, and we will talk to people as they come in about our ground rules here and how nonviolence is the way that we do things. And so that is both in terms of physical violence and in terms of verbal violence. Now, these women who were homeless were not safe on the streets. They they were robbed, they were raped, they were beaten, and their children weren't safe on the streets either. And so they would come into Sisters of the Road, and also it wasn't just for women, men could come in as well. Whenever anyone comes in to Sisters of the Road Cafe, they're told by the staff, this is how we do things here. We're respectful of one another. There's no bullying, no name calling, no physical violence. And so we ask you to abide by those ground rules. And so for the most part, people do, but of course, because they're coming in off the street where they are used to the violent way of living on the street, sometimes some of that erupts. And so when that happens, the staff will intervene and come over and say, just want to remind you here of our ground rules, and this is how we do things here, and you'll need to stop that name calling or stop hitting the person or whatever's going on there. And so, as you can imagine, this is a difficult job for staff. They have to be able to intervene in a way that is calm and respectful. They can't get triggered by the name calling or the bullying or the hitting that's going on. So they spend time rehearsing nonviolence in their staff meetings. And they will start with some silence, and then they will have a situation that they'll role play. And so they will, someone will be the person who is in the cafe bullying or hitting someone, and then someone else will be the person who is intervening. And they take a deep breath, they pray. Sisters of the Road is based on Catholic worker principles, and so they've been inspired by Dorothy Day and other Catholic worker folks. And so they'll breathe and pray and say, okay, I'm going to intervene in a nonviolent way here. I'll be respectful. I want to see that of God in the person who is exhibiting this bullying behavior or who's hitting the violent behavior, and I want to call out that of God in the person and not diminish that person's dignity while at the same time protecting the other person. And so they rehearse this in their staff meetings, and so then when these situations come up, as they inevitably do, they can intervene, and they say to the person, you know, this is how we do things here. You'll need to stop this behavior. If you can't stop, then you'll need to leave the cafe. Sometimes they do need to escort somebody out, and they say, you know, tomorrow's another day. You can come back tomorrow. You're always welcome as long as you are abiding by our ground rules. And so some people find that they are removed, and then they come back another day, and sometimes they do better. And so Sisters of the Road is not only a place where people can get a meal, it's a safe space for women and children, and it's also a place where people learn a different way of being, where people learn how to break the cycle of violence. Now, at Sisters of the Road, nobody gets a free handout. Everybody either works for a meal or pays for a meal. And so the jobs are things like sweeping or washing dishes, and you can sweep for 15 minutes and that will get you a meal. You can bank up time. If you sweep for half an hour, you get a meal now, and then you come back later and get another meal. Your name is written down for 15 minutes more. That it equals one meal. The women who have children have a space in the corner to care for their children and for the children to play. And they don't need to work in the cafe because the taking care of their children is seen as their work and good work. And so they can have a meal and their children can have a meal without working. At Sisters of the Road, Jenny Nelson and her colleagues found that people would keep coming back. And they did an exercise one time, a life mapping exercise, which was about all the relationships that people had in their lives. And, you know, if you or I did this kind of life mapping exercise, we would have our siblings, our parents, our spouses, children, extended family. Well, many of the folks who are homeless don't have family, or they've been alienated from their families. And so the people who showed up on their life maps were people at Sisters of the Road Cafe, or people at the Everett Street Service Center that provides overnight housing. It's a shelter. Or people at the office that helps homeless people get some day labor, or all of these different service agencies. And Jenny and her colleagues found that people were, once they got a job or a home and no longer needed those services, they had no relationships. They didn't have a network of relationships. So at Sisters of the Road, they said, you don't have to be homeless to come here. Anyone can come here. You can keep coming back after you get on your feet. And so people have been coming back for years. There's someone who still comes over for a cup of coffee, who has been working and on his feet for 25 years. And he still stops by Sisters of the Road because that's his community, and because he's supporting other people who are getting out of the cycle of homelessness. And so it's been a place where people can learn a different way of being. They also gain skills as they do the jobs around the cafe. They can move up to cook, and then they can get trained and get other restaurant jobs. And so like Grayston Bakery, which I talked about before last week, Sisters of the Road Cafe trains people to be employable and then helps them get jobs. And then there are other support services that they offer as well. They help people get clothes for an interview. They help people get, they tell them, okay, you have to shave and take a shower before you go to an interview. They teach them life skills that will help them succeed. So, Sisters of the Road Cafe, breaking the cycle of violence. Then I'd like to talk a little bit about Tom and Kate Chappell. Tom and Kate Chappell founded Tom's of Maine. And you may be familiar with Tom's of Maine. They make toothpaste and other personal care products. And Tom's of Maine got started when Tom was working, or the idea of it got started when Tom was working for an insurance company in Philadelphia. And he was doing well, and he and Kate had thought that was the life that they wanted. And yet something was saying to him, you know, this isn't for you. This is a fine job, but it's just not for you. And so Tom and Kate talked about this, and they both had a dream of living in a more rural environment, and they were very concerned about the environment, and they wanted to manufacture products that would be in harmony with the environment. And so they left Philadelphia, they moved to Maine, And at first they worked for Tom's father. They both worked in his company, and they said, oh, this isn't quite it. And so then they started their own company and tried one product, tried another product, and first it was very hard going, and they didn't know if they'd survive. And then they decided to try toothpaste, and it was a hit, and they started to do well, and they had some other products going as well. And by then they had several children, and so Kate was spending some time in the business and some time at home with the children, and Tom was spending a lot of time in the business. And as the business grew, Tom hired people. He thought, well, now I need experts who can help with the finance side and the marketing side, and this isn't just a little family business anymore. And so he hired people from Harvard Business School, graduates of Harvard Business School, and other people, and he got advice from them that he felt was taking away from the values that the company was founded on, the values of caring for the environment, making environmentally friendly products. Also, they wanted to provide their employees with a good living, and was an employee-friendly company. And so as he got this advice, he thought, well, maybe I can't really be true to my values and also have a successful business as the business grows. Maybe this is a whole new ball game, and I need to give up my values if my business is going to succeed. And he got depressed about that, and he thought, well, maybe I should go to seminary, and maybe I should be a minister, because I really care about my faith and my values. And so he did. And as he was talking one time with a trusted spiritual friend, the person said to him, Tom, maybe you're in seminary so that you can bring these deeper values back into your business, and instead of leaving your business and becoming a minister. And so Tom thought about that and prayed about that, said, I don't know, could my ministry really be my business? And so he learned to take retreats and to take time apart and pray and reflect, and decided that he would ask one of his seminary professors to come lead a retreat for the company employees. And so the seminary professor came, and first there was kind of a disconnect between this very intellectual seminary professor talking about ethics and values, and the employees who weren't very interested in philosophy and ethics. But they managed to bridge the gap and to start talking about, okay, what are our values and our ethics here at Tom's of Maine? And in doing this, taking this time for reflection and stepping back and having some silence and some retreat time, they were able to get back to what was really most important, the deepest values of the company. And so the people who were not in alignment with that ended up leaving. And Tom said, going to seminary was the best business decision I ever made, because it restored the deepest values. It restored his soul. And he and Kate were able to say, okay, this is what we're really about. And they discovered that it was better to hire for values and then train people for some of the skills that were needed than to hire for the skills and try to change people's values. And so as they then hired new people to replace the people who had left, they hired for those deeper values. And they said, you know, we do things like go on retreats, and you don't have to be religious, but you do have to be willing to be reflective and to take silence and to be in nature. And so they invited people into some of the practices that they were doing. And the people who were in alignment with that said yes, and they were able to move forward and continue to grow by staying true to their values. So I wonder if there are any questions or comments either on the earlier story, Breaking the Cycle of Violence, or Tom and Kate persevering to the end.
Margaret, what I appreciate about these stories is hearing what about what God is doing in these different areas, and it's not in a church building, you know, so that, you know, part of our deeper listening now, and I know, I don't know if Carmel is at the college today listening on this, but you know, we're going to be doing in the parish beginning this spring. We're looking at Rosberg's book about joining God, remaking church, and changing the world. You know, and it's about listening, learning how to listen more deeply for what God is doing outside of our church building, and joining God in what God is doing. And you know, that's still a paradigm shift. We've been talking about that for a number of years now, but it's still a paradigm shift for the church. Be able to think about, instead of inviting God to be in where we are and we are only, is, you know, what is God doing out in our neighborhoods, in our, you know, businesses and what have you. And so what I appreciate again about these stories is that it's God outside of, you know, the church building kind of thing. And that's not only inspiring, but it's a witness to how we need to be listening outside of our little box, you know. So I appreciate and value that, you know, that component of these stories.
Yes, yes, thank you, Gerald. And that's what these people were doing, like Jenny Nelson at Sisters of the Road was listening for what God was doing. And when she listened to the women, you know, over 100 hours of interviews with homeless women, she was listening for God's voice through those women, and saying, what does God want to do here? And she said, you know, so many services to homeless people are decided upon by people up high in some hierarchy who decide, oh, those people need this, those people need that. And she said, we need to listen to the people themselves, because God is in these people, and they have wisdom, and they know what they need. And so it is a listening for how is God at work, and how can we be part of that. And even Tom and Kate, you know, that's a business. They're making money. They're providing livelihood for themselves and others. And at the same time, when they started doing retreats, their faith was important to them. They were saying, what does God want to do through this business? Yeah. If Tom was saying, if I think of my business as my ministry, then I need to listen to how God is moving here and what God is inviting us into. And when they would do retreats with all the employees, they would listen. They would say, what do you see? What do you need? What do our customers need? Believing that God was in the midst of that too. God is not just in church. God loved the people in that company and the people they were serving as their customers. So thank you for that, Gerald. That was very much a part of what Sisters of the Road and Toms of Maine was and is about.
Yeah, thank you, Margaret.
Rick here. Just want to comment that my little bit of reflection on what you've shared with us this morning, Margaret, is really resounds a theme that I have been reflecting on recently, kind of in our role at Queen's College and theological education, I suppose, in the church generally, but the need, a kind of a prophetic role or discernment of our place in being able to listen, hear, and articulate what is needed now and for the future in the church, and as we have understood it, but even more so in the church as we need to come to understand it beyond the walls and the boundaries, but inclusive of those who are in or outside by choice or circumstance of the walls and the boundaries and what have you. And what is interesting in the stories that you've shared, particularly Tom's, is that his own genuine efforts were so important, but others had a kind of, I could say, prophetic role or a companioning or guiding role with him to help him to further refine and discern. And that, of course, required him trusting the discernment of others. So a few thoughts that come to my mind. It might be totally unrelated to your point, but
Thank you, Rick. No, those are very relevant. And, I think so often in churches, we see business people as people, number one, who can give money, people, number two, who can serve on the finance committee or the building and grounds committee, because they have that kind of experience with money and with property, and so we pull them in and give them those tasks in the church, and that's fine. It's good to use people's gifts, but if we stop there, it's limiting, because I think that we need to see business people and people like Jenny Nelson, who founded Sisters of the Road, who are out there doing their own ministries and serving people who have needs. We need to see people as ministers in their own settings, and like Tom, seeing, coming to see his business as his ministry. If the church can have eyes to see that as well, and maybe even have a commissioning service and have implements of people's work around the altar, and say, this is holy work in the world that everyone is doing, and then send people out, pray for them, and send them out to their work in the world, saying, we are supporting them. This church is supporting all these people who are ministers out in the world, and so to have eyes to see that, and to help everyone in the congregation see that, and to support them, instead of looking at the business people as the people who support the church financially or by serving on a committee. Serve them to do their ministry in the world. So, thank you, Rick.
This is Neil. What stands out for me from the two examples which you've given is that both parties see the real value and potential in a single human being, and identified the potential. They never leave them. The door is open. Even in the business community, Toms are always looking for potential people to help grow the business, and not only grow the business, but to invest in them to allow new values to be embraced by each individual employee. And the Sisters of the Road. It's very similar to a charitable organisation which we've got here called the Stella Burry Foundation
Ah,
that allows people with various disorders to be embraced, and not only be embraced, they have a cafe. People are trained to work in that cafe. They're also given responsibility and so on. Very similar to the Sisters of the Road. And uh, it that's where I think we can align biblically to
mhm,
the fact that we God never gives up on us. Uh,
mhm,
we have not always been as good in terms of organization.
mhm.
Mm.
Right, right. Yes, thank you. That is very true. In both of these examples, there is so much respect for individuals and for how God is at work in individuals and developing and supporting those individuals. Yes, thank you. Anyone else? You'll see here that I mentioned enduring dark nights for Tom and Kate. And as I told you, Tom had gotten depressed and discouraged when the business was growing, and when these people he hired had said, "Well, if you're going to be successful in business, you'll just have to let go of your values," and that was a dark night experience for him. And it was through going to seminary, going to Harvard Divinity School, and then having a spiritual guide who helped him reflect, and having retreats, taking a company on retreats, that he was able to move through that dark night. So I want to show you a diagram here that I call the leader's threefold path. And this is taken from the writings of great spiritual teachers who talk about the way of prayer. They talk about the stages that mystics go through. And as I observe these leaders and their journeys, it seemed to me that the leaders were invited into the same kind of a threefold path that is written about in so much spiritual literature. So, for example, you can find this in Evelyn Underhill's work on mysticism. You can find many different spiritual writers who will themselves talk about prayer in this way. And so I'll say just a little bit about it, and how it's often talked about in the work on prayer and mysticism. The purgative way, or the purgative stage, is a time of awakening to the awareness of spiritual reality. It's called purgative because those things that are not of God start to fall away. We discover in that first stage that God is a God who gives good gifts, and we realize that following a spiritual path brings an added dimension to life. We start to discover our addictions and attachments, and we let go of them. We discover that as we pray, our prayers get answered, and God does want to give us gifts. And so this is a time of discovery of God, of falling in love with God, and starting to let go of those things that are that get in the way of our relationship with God. And then often we come to, it's a pretty common pattern in the spiritual life, we hit the first dark night, a time when the abundant gifts from God begin to dry up. We're used to praying and all our prayers get answered. Well, it starts to seem like, my prayers aren't all getting answered. What's wrong? So we get confused. We miss that closeness to God. We start to question, what am I doing wrong? Maybe I'm praying wrong. And then often we'll redouble our efforts only to experience more dryness and frustration. And the way that many spiritual writers talk about this is they say, this is God weaning us from, we start to learn machine in the sky where we put in a prayer and then we get what we asked for. No, it's more about God shaping our prayers, God being the one who is transforming us. It's about learning to listen to God so that transformation can happen. So it's not just us coming with our agenda saying, God, do this, God, do that. It's a deepening and a maturing. And as we listen and let go and let God shape our prayers, let God transform us, we move into that illuminative stage. And the illuminative stage is often described as a time of good works and the flowering of the virtues. We have great energy to do God's work. We practice listening prayer. It's easier to persevere because we don't get thrown off quite as easily when our own agenda isn't being fulfilled. And we discover that the spiritual journey is about our own transformation. Then the second dark night comes when familiar approaches to prayer stop working. Even when we're listening, when we're letting God shape our prayer, it seems that God has disappeared. We can't hear. Even through alternative methods of prayer, God doesn't return. And this is a time of learning to desire God for God's self instead of for the gifts, instead of even for our own transformation. Or for guidance for the listening that we were receiving before. And so then if we persevere through this, we make it into the unitive experience. And this is an experience of where God is doing the work. We can let go. St. Teresa of Avila talks about this when she talks about the different stages of prayer. In the early stages, she talks about water and how in the beginning we have to carry buckets of water, and at the end, in the unitive, it's simply the rain coming down. We're gifted with it. It's simply God's good gifts, and we don't have to do anything. Now, this is often presented in this way as a linear chart, and I think it's really more like a spiral because I think that we go around and around this purgative, illuminative, unitive experience again and again, and with the dark nights in between, and that we go deeper and deeper each time. So it's an experience of a spiral and of deepening. So I saw this pattern in the leaders I interviewed, and I was lucky to interview leaders who were willing to deepen, who were willing to let God work in them, because this is very different from the typical idea of leadership in Western culture. And we're taught if we're leaders, we have to keep doing more and more. Things should keep getting bigger and better. And when Tom and Kate said, you know, wait a minute, our business has grown, but we're feeling dissatisfied here, and stepped back and said, what's going on, and what is God doing? And at first Tom thought, oh, maybe I should go to seminary and become a minister. But then to realize, no, that's not it. It's a calling to do a different kind of business, and to instead of just following the conventional wisdom and keep growing in the ways that are the ways of the world, it's a call to go deeper and to be true to the values. And yes, the business might keep growing, or it might stay the size that it is. What matters is listening and being true to the calling. So I wonder if there are any questions or comments about the leader's threefold path.
Margaret, the very instructive here with reference to you know, our own spiritual evolution, not only as leaders but as persons. And the charts that you put up, you know, are helpful in recognizing that path or that evolution. And I particularly like the way you put up the second, the one in front of us here now, about the spiral. You know, because it is, you know, this path, as we recognize that the invitation is always for us to go deeper on this path. You know, so we're rediscovering or re-experiencing these various components as we go deeper and as we listen more deeply, you know, for what God is doing. So it's very helpful in having an understanding of the path that we're experiencing as contemplatives. So I find that helpful, and thank you for that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, and you notice in the unitive, it's that fully letting go, and we feel like we're surrendering our autonomy, but really we're surrendering the illusion of autonomy. We never really have control, so we're surrendering the illusion of control. And it's not like we stay there all the time. You know, wouldn't it be great if we could stay in unitive mode all the time? We find ourselves going back and going through this again and again, and being invited to let go even more. So,
and what's helpful in that, Margaret, is for leaders in the church, you know, that when we look at, you know, our culture changing, our Sunday numbers changing, you know, is that it's not ours to control. And it's a part of the contemplative path, and as a contemplative leader, it's not about being in control or controlling results or manipulating whatever. It's about a surrendering to what God is doing and not what we are doing. And this is the part that invites freedom to be who we are and to be who we are becoming in God's world. And you know, so that's just so, I find that as a leader so inviting that kind of radical freedom, where it's not mine to control. I mean, it's like my life is not mine. I mean, you know, what is that saying? You know, is that your life is not about you. You are about life. You know, and you're right. And so, I mean, you know, the life of the church is not mine to control, but it's mine as a contemplative to listen more deeply for what God is doing and to cooperate with that. And so, you know, as a leader, I find that, so whatever it's going to be, whatever the uncertainties of tomorrow are, God is going to be in it anyway, because it's God's life. And that's the piece as a contemplative. I say, thanks be to God.
Right. Yes. Thank you, Gerald. And that's a perfect segue to the next part. So you'll see here that this chart is about the organization's threefold path. And so not only did I see leaders going through this, I saw organizations going through this. And so, for example, at Tom's of Maine, when Tom hit that first dark night, it was a dark night for the company as well. You know, the question was, well, do we go forward and let go of our values, or do we stay true to our values, and does that mean we'll fail as a company, or we can't grow, or what's going on here? You know, there was that sense of confusion, and during this time, the naysayers' voices got stronger, and it was a very hard time. And you know, in Western culture, there's also this idea that the organization should always get bigger and better. The business should get bigger and better. The church should get bigger and better. There's this equation of bigger with better, and that's not always the way it is. And so I think during that dark night, we can stop and say, oh, okay, so help me listen, God, and what is it that you're doing through this church right now? And maybe we've fulfilled what we were put here to do, or maybe the original calling is to be lived out in a different way now. For example, I know a church here in the Washington, D.C. area that had been in a downtown area in Northern Virginia for a long time, and the property values had gone up. And one big problem in the area was affordable housing. And they said, well, what if we sell our property for affordable housing, and we will help work out the arrangement for this affordable housing to happen, and then we can rent space. We don't need this big building anymore. We're not a big congregation like we used to be. And it was a very creative way of listening to the needs in the community, listening to God's call on them, and to say, we can let go of this big building, we can let go of the way we've always been, and we can be open to some new manifestation of how God can work through us in the world we're in now. And so I think that so often, you know, clergy feel, oh, it's my job to make this this parish thrive again, and if I don't, I'm a failure. If we close the doors, we're a failure. Well, I don't think that church in Arlington, Virginia was a failure at all. I think they are doing God's work in the way that is needed in this world today. And so if we listen during that first dark night and let God shape our prayers corporately as well as individually, as a faith community, or as a business, or as a charity, then we can move into the illuminative phase, and we can experience that that new way of being, of productiveness, of fruitfulness, of having energy for God, and it could be in a whole new manifestation. So again, then the second dark night can come, and for Tom's of Maine, it happened when they were wondering, well, how does this legacy get carried on? And they were weary. They were ready to retire. They thought, you know, are there people here who could take it over? The usual thing would be to have in a family company would be for the children to take it over, but Tom and Kate's 5 children, none of them wanted to take over the company, and so were there employees who were in that position to take it over? No, and so it seemed like there was no way forward, and uh, and then they were able to, by again letting go, um, opening to something new and saying, if this business needs to die, okay, maybe it served its purpose, that's okay. But then they were able to clarify their values and get new energy. And they ended up selling to a company that was a bigger company that said, we really like your values and we would like to help this company continue to thrive, and we'd like you to stay on for a while and teach us some of your ways of doing things, some of your values for our bigger company to absorb. And so again, the organizational threefold path, I think, is more of a spiral than a linear model. And so you can see how, again, we go around the spiral again and again. We don't just reach the unitive way and stay there as an organization. And it keeps us humble, We have to keep coming back and saying, here I am at Shalem as the executive director, and one of the things that we're doing at our staff board retreat this weekend is going back and rereading the founders report that our founder Tilden Edwards wrote when he was retiring in 2000, and where he names the charism of Shalem and how that charism was manifested in the early days. And so we're asking ourselves, here we are 45 years after the founding of Shalem, and how is that charism to be manifested today? And even ask the question, well, maybe Shalem has completed its work in the world and others will carry it on. Doesn't seem to be where we are right now, but I think it's a question we always have to be open to. And are we being faithful to what God is calling us to? We don't want to get in the business of just perpetuating the institution. We want to be faithful. And as you said, Gerald, that's so liberating to be saying, well, what is God doing? And then what is our part in that? Instead of, oh, what should we do? And then ask God to bless it. No, what is God already doing? And then what is our part? How do we join in? And so that's the organizational threefold path, and wondering if anyone has any comments or questions about that.
So my only comment would be the wisdom and the prudence of that continuous examination and pondering of our being on a journey, and continuing to look at the vision and goals, what's accomplished or achieved or progress, whatever way we would describe it, but also acknowledging that there can be a time when we discern that to suspend what we're doing is the right thing to do, and it takes courage to do that, and perhaps the doing of it in itself is a reflection of the kind of spiritual maturity that comes about as one is genuine in their contemplation and I suppose the apostolic commitment that one would have.
Yes, yes, yes.
One of, if I can just continue for a moment, perhaps one of the things that brings such challenge to organizations of all sorts, but I think particularly within the church, is that zeal to forge ahead doing what we have always done without taking the time to reflect and to contemplate and to revise as needed. And it brings its own paralysis, really, by resisting change.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes. Well put. Thank you.
Margaret, this is Gladys.
Gladys?
I just wanted to say that what you're saying, I find it very comforting because I experience it all in my own prayer life. And I love the unitive stage, and I so wish that I could stay there, but I can't because I keep falling back to not only the second dark night, but the third and the fourth and the fifth, and so on it goes. Also, I'm a lover of Teresa of Avila, and I'm presently reading that again now. And so all of this is familiar, but when you experience it in your own life, it's so real. But it is comforting in a lot of ways because, you know, it's so easy to get frustrated and say, you know, all these years I've been doing contemplative prayer and I'm no further ahead now than I ever was, which is not the truth, but somehow we feel that way, or I feel that way sometimes. And then sometimes I'm just up on that mountain. I'm at the unitive stage. It is so wonderful. And I just wish I could stay there, but as sure as I'm sitting here, something is going to come up and off I go again. So I want to thank you because what you've been doing for me this morning is pulling a lot of things together, putting a lot of things. You're synthesizing for me, which is absolutely wonderful. And I thank you for that.
Yeah, you're welcome, and thank you, Gladys. And you say it so well. You know, you're up there on that mountain, and it's so wonderful. You want to stay there, and then something pulls you back, and you know that's the human condition. There's some great spiritual teacher who says, if you think you're fully evolved, just go spend a week with your family of origin, and. I think that's a great one. I mean, it's certainly true for me. You know, my father is still living at 91, and I go visit my father and stepmother, and my siblings and their families are there, and we just all fall back into those roles we were in when we were growing up, and it's so easy to get pulled into those dynamics. And yeah, you know, you're right. We have made some progress, and yet we notice our humanness and how we can't stay in the unitive place all the time. So, thank you. So, I'd like to invite you now to enliven the purpose in your organization, wherever you are, whether this is in the church or in a charity, or could even be in a neighborhood organization. And so some of the themes that I drew out from listening to these people when I interviewed them, these leaders and the employees in the organizations, you are empowered wherever you are in your church, in your neighborhood, or you know, you can be a person who is contemplatively grounded. You can be someone who speaks the word of humor, or the word of grace, or the word of encouragement. You don't have to be the top leader to make a difference. wherever you are in the organization, you are empowered. And second, listen for purpose. Listen for the people who have a sense of purpose, who are, and you know, this could be as simple as the person who cleans the church and sees it as a ministry and who wants to do a really nice job so the children have clean Sunday school rooms, or anywhere where you see that sense of purpose, to encourage that and to say, yes, we're all in this together and we're doing God's work. Third, don't go it alone. Connect with others. Connect with those who have a sense of purpose. Connect with those who want to listen to God with you, who want to keep returning to that open-hearted listening prayer. And finally, patience in peril. You know, it's those times, those dark nights are the times when it's darkest just before the dawn. And so to have patience in those times when you feel like you're in peril, to know that there will be breakthrough. And again, God is the one who's at work. It's not all on your shoulders. And to have patience that there will be the breakthrough after the dark night. So I invite you now to take a moment to reflect. You might remember back back a week ago, I invited you to reflect on your soul score, yourself and your team and your organization. You might still have that with you, and you might think about, well, is there anything I could do about that to make my own soul score a little higher, or to help encourage my team or my organization? Second, I talked about following the heart, daring to dream, keeping mission at the fore, practicing gratitude. Those were all last week. And then this week, nonviolence, the dark night. Is there any commitment you'd like to make to yourself or others about practicing something or reflecting on something there? And then finally, enlivening the organizational purpose that I just talked about in the previous slide. This one, remember, you're empowered, listen for purpose, don't go it alone, patience in peril. So I invite you to take a moment and write if you want, or simply reflect. Any commitment you'd like to make to yourself or to your team or to another person in any of those areas, whatever stood out to you in those different areas. So let's take a couple minutes of silence, and you can write or reflect. invite you to share with whatever the group of people you're with. If you're with a big group, then share in pairs. If you're in a smaller group, you can share in the whole group. And share whatever you're comfortable sharing about the commitment you'd like to make to yourself or to a group or to another person. And so take 5 minutes for this, and then we'll come back together in the whole group. Take another minute to finish up your sharing with your pair or your small group. So now I'd like to invite you to share with the whole group, with all of us. Feel free if there's anyone who would like to share, and you know, be as specific or as general as you want. Share whatever you're comfortable sharing.
Neil here. I personally have identified long ago that I need to take more time to listen to the other party, or at least give the other party time to finish what they wanted to say. Because often I'll think about a response, and I'm anxious to get that response out, because if I don't get it out, I may forget about what it was anyway. I'm at that stage in life, I think. But I'm quite sure that if I worked on that, rather, the soul score would improve a little. Yeah.
Thank you, Neil.
That's where I am, anyway.
Yes, thank you.
Kind of related to that, I find the challenge is to genuinely listen and hear, but also to be able to hear in a way that helps me, or to discern what am I really hearing, because you know, in the context of this contemplative leadership, in a leadership role, whether it's in the organization that I'm in or in community volunteer roles that I have, or in family, I suppose, as far as that goes, some of what I hear is resistance to things that I also hear need to be brought forward, and trying to, I suppose, hear the full scope and maybe discern how do I find, I don't know if just finding a happy medium that satisfies everyone. I've never had much success with that, just being mediocre on it. But to me, that is a personal challenge, I must say, and one that, you know, I just pray for the wisdom and the guidance to be able to, yes, listen, but be able to respond to, I suppose, what I might say to be the extremes that I would hear on matters that we're bringing forward, and to be able to do the right thing. And I'm never 100% sure, but maybe that's all part of it, the leap of faith, isn't it?
Yes, thank you, Rick. And you know, I think that's all about discernment, and there's the discernment of you as a leader, and then there's the corporate discernment of the group, and how do we listen for God's voice in the midst of all the different voices? It's not always the happy medium. Sometimes it's one of the voices that maybe we don't like at first is being prophetic, and we need to listen, and or maybe we're the prophet, and it's hard to keep saying that message that other people don't seem to be hearing, and we keep praying, God, is this really from you? And can't I let go of it? And when is it arrogance and stubbornness, and when is it faithfulness? And you know, all those questions are questions of discernment, and how do we do corporate or communal discernment? You know, there are practices for doing that, and for listening deeply to one another, taking some silence in between speakers, listening for what seems to be emerging, listening especially to the person you disagree with, for could there be some wisdom of God in that person? So you raise really important questions. Thank you. And I'll say more next time about corporate or communal discernment.
Good.
Margaret, this is Gladys.
I'm
Um,
glad.
I think my commitment is partly to myself, because I think it's important that I know myself, that I know my true self, and that I come to know it better, so that in whatever role I take on, whether it's a teaching role or an organizational role or whatever the role is, that I allow God to take the leadership and allow myself to be directed more and more. And in doing that, I find that I give others the freedom to be themselves, that they're more comfortable with being who they are, because more and more they're seeing who I am, and I think that's the commitment I would like to make, and I am making.
Thank you, Gladys. Yes. Yes. Anyone else? And I'd like to close with the same prayer that I started with. And so again, I'll say those first two verses, and we'll take a little silence, and then I'll close with a portion of them again. Let's pray. That cause can neither be lost nor stayed, that takes the course of what God has made, and is not trusting in walls or towers, but quietly growing from seeds to flowers. Each noble service that has been wrought was first conceived as a fruitful thought. Each worthy cause with a future glorious, by quietly growing, becomes victorious. That cause can neither be lost nor stayed, that takes the course of what God has made. Amen. Blessings on your week, everyone.
Blessings
Look
on
forward
you.
to being next week.
Blessings on you, Margaret.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you all, folks, and we'll be back at it same time next week. I'll be posting the recordings for last weekend this week and sending the links to all and to others who were interested as well.
Great.
Good.
Thank you, Rick.
So thank you.
Take care. You're welcome.
Bye-bye.
Good to be with you. Bye-bye.
Bye.